preparation for the United Nations Association's test of English.
Preliminary note: the Trans-Pacific Partnership (TPP) agreement is a multifaceted, regionalist agreement for 12 Pacific Rim countries. During the final stage of its negotiations in 2015, the United States was active with Japan in bridging differences. In 2017, the Japanese government, whose parliament had ratified the agreement, took the diplomatic initiative to renegotiate TPP provisions and rescue the agreement, now known as Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership (CPTPP), in light of the U.S. withdrawal. Question 1. Explain the history of TPP, focusing on how it has evolved over time. This essay consists of 6 paragraphs. 1. TPSEP. 2. TPP 12 membership. 3. Dual leadership. 4. U.S. withdrawal. 5. TPP 11. 6. CPTPP.
1. TPSEP. Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, whose agreement was signed by its 12, TPP 12, signatories in February 2016, and evolved from Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, TPSEP. The earlier agreement, which was signed in 2005 by Brunei, Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, and entered into force in February 2006, was a multifaceted agreement, covering not only rules related to trade in goods and services, but also many other areas such as rules of origin, intellectual property protection, government procurement, competition policy, and the like.
2. TPP 12 membership. The TPSEP agreement also contained a provision that encouraged the signatories to solicit others to join the agreement. Thus, in February 2008, the United States, the US, under the George W. Bush administration, took advantage of the TPSEP in negotiating with Pacific Rim countries. Consequently, toward the end of the year, in November 2008, 3 additional countries, Australia, Peru and Vietnam, joined the negotiating group. Then, 4 additional countries joined the TPP negotiations, namely, Malaysia in October 2010, Mexico and Canada in October 2012, and finally Japan in May 2013. They completed the TPP 12 membership.
3. Dual leadership. The TPP 12 countries actively negotiated under the dual leadership of the US and Japan, particularly toward the final stage of negotiations, which eventually led to the completion of the TPP agreement, Atlanta, the US, October 2015, and its signing, Auckland, New Zealand, February 2016.
4. The U.S. withdrawal. Throughout 2016, a presidential election year, the TPP agreement faced a problematic period in the U.S. The public support in the U.S. toward its government's policy initiative, involving Pacific Rim countries, was far from clear. Consequently, the precarious situation in the U.S. prevented the TPP 12 countries from ratifying the TPP agreement. On January 23, 2017, President Trump signed an executive order to withdraw the U.S. from the TPP membership.
5. TPP 11. The TPP's remaining 11 members, TPP 11, met in Chile and Vietnam in March and May 2017, respectively, and agreed to thrash out a way forward on the TPP 11 agreement. The participating ministers reaffirmed the commitment to realizing TPP 11 by suspending, freezing the provisions of the original TPP related to the U.S., presumably until the countries return to the TPP membership in the future. 6. CPTPP.
In January 2018, the TPP 11 members agreed on a revised TPP, now officially called the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP or TPP 11 in short. Meanwhile, many Pacific Rim countries have announced their interest, of different degrees of intensity, in joining TPP, TPP 11, Colombia, 2010, the Philippines, 2010, Thailand, 2012, Taiwan, 2013, South Korea, 2013, Indonesia, 2015, and China, 2020. And, beyond the Pacific Rim region, Sri Lanka, 2020, and Great Britain, 2020.
Preliminary note. Upon assuming office in 2009, President Obama mobilized large amounts of public funds to stimulate the U.S. economy, which was suffering from a major recession. The Obama administration also came to embrace the regionalist framework of TPP as a way of securing overseas markets of U.S. exports, thereby reducing, if not eliminating, the chronic trade deficits. The United States, U.S., and Japan were the two dominant actors in multilateral talks that eventually led to the TPP agreement in 2016. Question 2. Explain the historical significance and major reasons of the United States' involvement in and contribution to the process of reaching the TPP agreement.
This essay consists of 4 paragraphs. 1. Bush Jr. and Obama. 2. Path to TPP. 3. WTO-plus provisions. 4. Trump. 1. Bush Jr. and Obama. In February 2008, President George W. Bush announced that the U.S. would begin multilateral talks with the P4 countries, Pacific 4, Brunei, Chile, New Zealand and Singapore, on the issues of trade in services, particularly financial services, and international investment. On the other hand, during the 2008 electoral campaign year, Barack Obama was critical towards TPP, but his administration began to support this multilateral framework in 2009.
2. Path to TPP. Let us point out several factors that seemingly guided the U.S., both Bush and Obama, toward TPP regionalism. First, the Bush administration contemplated the idea of building the free trade area of the Americas by scaling up NAFTA-type regionalism to include Latin America. However, the idea faced the opposition of the 4 Latin American countries that had formed the South American free market. Second, the WTO's Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations, which had been launched in 2001, turned out to be extremely difficult, ending up in an impasse by the end of the 2000s. And third, President Obama, 2009–2017, thought that given East Asia having become a global growth center, an integrated market with the region's economies would appear to be consistent with his balancing strategy involving Asia-Pacific.
3. WTO-plus provisions. The TPP negotiators fully took advantage of their own pre-existing bilateral free trade agreements as the prototype base to construct the TPP provisions. The U.S.-chaired TPP ministerial meeting held in Atlanta in October 2015 was instrumental in terms of incorporating many provisions that are not normally dealt with at WTO negotiations. These WTO-plus provisions include, among others, the Code of Conducts related to environment and labor.
4. Trump. Meanwhile, we witnessed a rapid rise of critical views among American voters toward U.S. foreign policy under Democratic presidents. Many politicians in the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign expressed their concern on the TPP agreement, which was then waiting for congressional ratification. Republican candidate Trump disclosed his firm intention of the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP agreement, if he were elected. Accordingly, on January 23, 2019, the first official day at the White House, President Trump signed the executive order to authorize the withdrawal. Now, the Biden administration has begun. Keep an eye on his TPP policy. The next essay will be Japan and TPP and Future of TPP. Please don't miss it. Thank you for watching. Have a good one. Cheers.